to go.
Okay, thanks. Welcome, everybody. Looks like we've got quite a crowd. I'm pleasantly surprised by that. Guten Tag to those of you calling in from Germany, and hello to those of you coming in from the north. I think I saw at least one of my students is on, and a couple of my RAND colleagues. So hopefully that means it's a friendly audience. We'll see. Sebastian asked me to come and talk about a project that John Gentile and I did several years ago, evaluating something called the Reconnaissance Strike Group, and for which we developed a technique that we called an Adjudicated Tabletop Exercise, or a TTX. And so today I'm going to talk about Adjudicated Tabletop Exercises and use the RSG experience as the background for that. The one thing I have to sort of caveat to everybody is I can't answer a lot of questions specifically about what our findings were, because the report is still listed as FOUO while we're waiting for it to clear public affairs and get fully declassified. So I can talk about sort of the tactics, techniques, and procedures, if you will, of doing this adjudicated TTX. And I can talk in general terms about how we did it and what kinds of findings it's good for helping you discover. But I can't answer some of your questions about what we ended up recommending to the Army and to Congress about the RSG itself. The second thing I'll say, as we're on this title slide, is just to sort of orient you to it a little bit, and this will you'll see this, understand this later in the context of what I'll talk about. But you see two different maps here for two different runs of the scenario. Where you see the red counters, that map is an operational map. I think it was 10 or 15 kilometers per hex or per square. And the counters represented generally company-sized units and a couple of key other platforms. So that was the level of analysis for that part of the TTX. And then on the other map where you see blue, we actually went down to where each counter represented an individual vehicle or platform. And we did some a version of the TTX at that level of detail on this more tactical map. And you'll see where that goes. So without too much further ado, let me dive into sort of what we were all about, if I can figure out how to work controls on my own computer. There we go. All right, so what were we asked to do? So the House passes, well, the Congress passes a National Defense Authorization Act, and in it they tell the Chief of Staff of the Army, in consultation with UCOM and some others, to do separate analyses of the Army operational concepts and organizational designs known as the Reconnaissance Strike Group. Now, the RSG is sort of the culmination of years of work that this guy, Doug Macgregor, has put into arguing that the Army should originally break the phalanx. So he was one of the early advocates for getting rid of a divisionally based Army and fighting in what he has called groups. He didn't believe that the move to the Brigade Combat Team centric Army fully moved in the direction that he wanted or thought the Army needed to go. So he wrote a second book, Transformation Under Fire. And then finally, which came out, I think, in 2004, 2005, 2006 timeframe. And then he wrote some other books more recently. But through contacts he had with the Senate Armed Services Committee professional staff, and specifically, I think, but I'm not sure, with Senator McCain and some others, he was able to give several briefings to key members of Congress or their staffs and convince them that the Army was not giving due diligence to some of these concepts for this Reconnaissance Strike Group idea that he had. And so we were asked, the military was asked, directed by Congress, to do some studies about it and to answer back about why they weren't adopting Macgregor's recommendations or what they thought about Macgregor's recommendations. And his recommendations were fairly holistic. They covered not just the division or the RSG design. There were other strike group specific types that he did. He had some very expansive ideas about how to reshape the joint force including the command and control at the major command level, including how we did operational control in theater, and then the types of formations that we had. But the sort of centerpiece of it, and the one that was most well-defined, was this RSG. And so the Army asked us to do their analysis as an independent activity. So that when they did report back to Congress, the feeling was, and this is one of the niches that RAND fills, is they could say, you asked us to do the analysis, but we're aware that there's a perception we might have been biased in our response. So we've asked an external set of experts to do an independent analysis. And here are their findings based on the questions that we've passed on to them from you. So this is a task John and I got, was to try to help the Army respond to Congress and do, we believed, a necessary independent evaluation of the RSG, which at first blush, we both thought had a lot of good ideas in it, but we also saw some challenges with it. And I'll go through some of those as we continue here. So what is a Reconnaissance Strike Group? So this is part of a Macgregor briefing to the National Commission on the Future of the Army, where he and this Burke-Macgregor group that I'll talk about throughout here developed their own Lanchestrian spreadsheet-based sort of model based on a set of platforms that he included in the RSG, using, and the vast majority of these platforms were either not yet built, but he believed were feasible. They were variants of existing platforms, specifically the Puma and some others. But he cobbled together this set of systems, or what he believed were potentially fieldable systems within the next several years, created his own sort of killer victim scorecard for that, ran it through this model that they'd created, and briefed the National Commission on these kinds of outcomes. So you can see here, you know, the blue force is defending with a striker brigade and 2 ABCTs plus some other things, and red, you know, defeats blue. When you're doing it with a different mix of strikers and ABCTs, red still defeats blue. And then you come down, and with a fraction of the forces, 11,000 instead of 24 or 28,000, or 5,500 instead of 28 or 24,000, 1 or 2 RSGs is able to reverse everything. And this is the claim. And then he also claimed that because these systems he was talking about fielding were cheaper than the projected systems that were going to be created, and that were more deployable, that the force itself was also fundamentally cheaper, on the orders of tens of billions of dollars. So he also, though, like I said, was holistic in this. It wasn't just a combat formation that sort of approximated the combat power of what we would think of as a heavy division, encapsulated in the size of what we would think of as a reinforced armored brigade combat team. He had different strategic assumptions. He said it fought fundamentally differently, and he talked a lot about the way it would fight differently. He would give it different missions, so not normal sorts of attacks and defends in zone and those kinds of things. He had the new force design and the new capabilities and the new employment paradigm. And in fact, he also claimed it would be trained better and differently, that the leadership would be different. He had a different grade plate with higher levels of command and different kinds of staffing. So he really covered the entire spectrum of .mil PF, not so much the F. So I sort of leave that off, and certainly not the policy level, but inside of .mil P, he had a wide variety of things. And all of this is stuff that we're supposed to try to figure out a way to evaluate and to validate whether or not we believed that his claims were feasible, and make some recommendations about what the Army should adopt or discount in terms of the RSG and the accompanying concepts for it. So to go through in a little bit more depth, and I'll stop before I get into sort of the TTX pieces and the others and let you guys ask some questions about the RSG. You know, the system. So you see this Puma system, and he says it's fielded, but actually the variant he wanted and the way he modeled it represented a not yet fielded system. It represented something that Rheinmetall thought they could do. It certainly did not stretch the imagination to believe it was possible, but it didn't exist. The advanced mortar system, again, prototypes existed. The particular variant that he wanted to use was, again, sort of a stretch goal over what had already been fielded. The MLRS is well known. NASAMS, this National Advanced Surface to Air Missile System, again, a sort of existing system, not one in sort of full development, but one on which we could get some performance data. These TARIs, the Tactical Advanced Recon Strike, is an unmanned combat aviation vehicle. And this was another one where we had a lot of paper deep sort of claims about what it could do, but we didn't have any really operational data on it. And these aren't the only systems. There were other systems, including tethered comm systems that relied on a armored vehicle to tow a tether with a balloon floating at the top of the tether, so you could raise it and lower it to to treetop level and use it as a comms and intel system, and a whole variety of other things. This new doctrine of his, which really in many ways wasn't all that new, it was just repackaging of a lot of air-land battle kinds of concepts, but faster over a broader span of control over a broader geographic area. And in actuality, when I looked at it, the first thing I thought of was David Chandler's classic description of Napoleon's corps and the way he used them. This is really nothing more than that. It's sort of each of these RSG battalions, operates along a particular axis in this diamond formation. The one that makes contact fixes an enemy. The other three maneuver to the sound of the guns, coordinated by the RSG commander to complete the destruction of the enemy or to fulfill the mission. He's got some other sort of aspects in there also, but again, a new doctrine, one for which we didn't have sort of an existing modeling and simulation or game design, and something we were going to have to work within. It's new command and control concept. The brigadier general as the group commander, not sort of revolutionary. The idea of a colonel or chief as chief of staff, not really revolutionary. We've had separate brigades before that had one-star commanders in it. Again, staff, his version of the staff with a maneuver ops, including PsyOps, an ISR coordinator, a strike coordinator, your sustainment and logistics, and then your information and cyber guy. And some very strong ideas about their abilities to do reach back through higher echelons of a similar kind of formation that was focused on ISR into the JTF headquarters and leverage national and strategic level assets that would be in the area. So very much a connected ISR operation that relied on reach back and on feeding into these operational and national systems. You can see the comparison below for the formations themselves, and a lot of claims from Macgregor about logistics and how far he could go. He relied on tracked logistics vehicles that could keep up with the maneuver formations cross country and that had large cargo capacities and that minimized the needs for resupply. We can talk a little bit about some of the challenges we found with that later, but we had to understand how his concept of logistics enabled him to do some of the maneuver over distances and in time frames that he talked about in ways that we might have judged you couldn't do with current Army logistics concepts and systems. So, so there's that. So again, before I get too far into this, the key research questions for us were how to compare and contrast the RSG and the BCT, driven by this whole question of how do you evaluate a formation that doesn't exist, which uses equipment that doesn't exist? And can you duplicate these model results that the Burke-Macgregor models came up with? And how do you incorporate into that analysis what would normally be thought of as soft things like leadership, training, and logistics? And this is the environment, of research questions into which we had to come up with a solution. So I'll stop there and just see what kind of questions there might be about the RSG itself. I've got some backup slides I can get to that give Macgregor's answers on them, but let me see what your questions are.
Hey, Mike, we have a couple of questions. I will take the prerogative as facilitator and ask my question first.
Sure.
For those who are not versed in the Army and how it works. So for those who are unfamiliar with how the Army fights, how would you describe the key differences between the current Army Brigade Combat Team or ABCT model and the RSG model proposed by Macgregor?
So the two key differences I would think are that even though we call ourselves today a BCT centric Army, we still have an echelon of command at the division level that plays a critical role for coordinating activities of multiple brigade combat teams in an operational area. And that takes on some of the responsibilities for deconflicting along unit boundaries, both within the division subordinate units and between the division and its adjacent units. The RSG really reports directly to the JTF commander. It eliminates an entire echelon of operational command. And it places this 1-star in the position of having oversight of an area that normally we would have a 2-star with his entire staff taking part of, while he parceled out, or she, pieces of it to subordinate brigades. So it vastly expands the sight horizon, the scope of the area in which this RSG commander is expected to operate. And that's probably the single biggest difference. The other differences, again, and this is what we were trying to sort of understand, is this claim that it fights fundamentally differently, that it uses speed and sensors and comms and training to be able to operate over a far more distributed area than we would think of a similar size regular Army formation being able to operate in. And so although the Army has always talked about, moving dispersed and fighting coordinated or fighting consolidated, or about the ability to mass effects, Macgregor takes that to sort of another level in terms of the amount of dispersion and then the ability to rapidly coalesce in mass effects than I think anybody in the Army envisions is possible with the BCT. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the TTX itself. So what else?
Mike, we had a question that's semi-related, is what differentiates the RSG model from the older Armored Cavalry Regiment model?
Again, it's you could think of it as a modernized, hyped up version of it. Macgregor is a cavalryman and is part of that part of the Army that believes in the cavalry model as having sort of advantages over others. So, in a lot of ways, there are more differences in scale than they are differences in type. Macgregor envisions, again, larger distances, faster speed of reaction, but similar kinds of missions and similar kinds of ways of thinking about using that echelon, using that kind of capability.
The next question is sort of logistical in the sense is you mentioned a RAND report about the RSG and our TTX. Once finalized and cleared to the various organizations, will there be a public report available on the RAND website?
So we have submitted the document to the approval authorities for clearance, and we have requested in that it be downgraded from FOUO to unclassified. If the first thing happens and it's cleared for publication, but cleared only at the FOUO, then obviously it'll be available, but only for official use. If we're successful in getting it reclassified from FOUO to unclassified, then it will become like any other RAND research report and available for free download in the PDF version from our website or to be ordered from our website. We have no idea if or when either of those things will happen.
So next question is, can you explain some of the logic behind the specific choices and systems that occupy or exist within the RSG? Like why the Puma, why the Amos?
So what Macgregor's trying to do is a couple of things. First off, he's reducing the size of the formation. So he has fewer dismounts. It's kind of more like a Russian formation in that sense. He's moving towards auto loaders in tanks or that kind of vehicle. He's moving towards automated mortars to get a more rapid rate of fire. Amos is a dual mortar system, so it puts out a lot more rounds per minute for fewer troops. And in fact, you know, it might be a system that the Army could or should look at from an operational standpoint, regardless of the operational concept that it supports. There's a lot to be said about the Amos system. It's one of the ones that we liked. But what he's really trying to do is to create, again, the ability to rapidly create effects on platforms that have a common chassis. So he's trying to find as much commonality in chassis as he can, which is why he puts his logistics vehicles on the same chassis as his combat vehicles, just with an extended hull to get the extra cargo space, so that he can minimize the different types of maintenance that he needs, the different types of spare parts. So he's trying to find ways to be efficient with the number of people he needs while still increasing the rate of fire he can achieve, and increasing the mobility under armor, so the protection of his formation. Those are some of the key design concepts behind what he's trying to do. And all of them are actually very worthy, goals. They just all include some kinds of trade-offs, some of which we were able to talk about. So
I'll address some more specific questions to the RSG and combine some questions for time's sake.
Sure.
How big is the RSG headquartered with the 5 lieutenant colonels as branch heads? And can you also speak to the counter mobility and assets since the engineer battalion goes away within the RSG model? Does it require some kind of augmentation from outside the RSG? As you notice, there's some Army folks who snuck into this presentation with very specific questions.
Yeah, and it doesn't have a lot of counter mobility capability. It doesn't have a lot of mobility capability for that matter. Those are not key aspects of the way he thinks he needs to fight. And for fights where mobility, breaching assets and gap crossing assets are critical, he has a different kind of heavy strike group, which looks a lot like an augmented ABCT. But the fight that he's most interested in is being able to fight early in the campaign before you need that. And he's a cavalryman. Cavalrymen don't use a lot of counter mobility. They use speed. And that's reflected in the design of his formation. His headquarters tend to be small. I think I've got in some of the backup slides the actual numbers. I can go look for them. But they are smaller than current battalion and brigade staffs in many ways. And he believes that there will be automated intelligence tools and other kinds of mission command tools that will operate in a more seamless and integrated command and control structure, which he talked about, but didn't really tell us how he was going to achieve, that would enable better situational awareness across a broader set of distances, and enable faster mission command processes so that you could basically break the enemy's OODA loop. And he, again, believed that this was something that we could train better, and that when you trained the formation better, you could achieve these kinds of efficiencies. So, and I'll talk a little bit again later about how we had, because we had all of these same questions about how we sort of dealt with that in our analysis. So a couple of wrap-up questions maybe, and then I'll move on to the analytics section.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I'll end this segment of questions with this last one is, would this concept be useful to other allied countries like Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and NATO countries?
The RSG concept or the TTX concept? So I'm neither going to endorse nor fail to endorse the RSG. You know, again, I can't really talk a whole lot about our findings. I can talk about my understanding of Macgregor's intent. But at the end of the day, I think that there are very many very valuable things that you could mine from the RSG. I'm not convinced in my own mind that adopting it in whole cloth is right for anybody. But that's, you know, a different question.
That's great. Mike, you can proceed on with your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So, oh, there we go. All right. So why an adjudicated tabletop exercise? And I'll, you know, in other words, what other tools were out there that we could have used, and why did we reject them? So we had this Lanchestrian model that the Burke Macgregor group had created and used, and we dissected it and we reverse engineered it, and we spent a couple of days with a guy who devised it. And at the end of the day, we just weren't comfortable with the mechanics of it. We didn't really think that it correctly captured the loss exchange ratios for the kinds of things we were talking about. And like all Lanchestrian models, you know, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that are baked into it about weapons effectiveness and weapons efficiency and probability of hit, probability of kill, distances for engagements. And we couldn't find an empirical basis for a lot of what lay under that. So we were never comfortable saying, and I won't say today, that their model was wrong. It's just not a model we were comfortable with, and not a model that we wanted to recreate. And part of the reason we didn't want to recreate it is because you didn't have enough data or information to do modeling and simulation, or to create a Lanchestrian model, a killer victim scoreboard, or any of the kinds of things you might have done in a JICM environment, where you try to create systems, new systems to put into JICM that didn't already exist. We didn't have, nor were we willing to speculate on what the range of parameters would be that will allow us to do effective modeling and simulation, especially for some of the C2 and Intel systems and some of the artillery delivered fire systems. So that sort of threw out two sets of traditional ways of doing this. And even a traditional war game, you know, even the traditional board game that you would play, we didn't really have the right kinds of data to assign an attack factor or a defense factor to a unit on a hex-based game. You know, we didn't know what the range effects were. That these were unknowns for us, or at least unknown outside of certain parameters, but the parameters themselves were wide enough that rather than trying to run the game 6 or 7 times by varying the parameters each time, or varying the instantiation within the parameter each time, we wanted to do something else. Same thing with movement rates. And then of course, these soft things, the effects of command and control, leadership training and sustainment, were all things that, normally you might say, okay, this country armed with M1 tanks, I'm going to give the combat factor of 6 because of their command and control, sustainment and training and leadership. But that partner company with the exact same platform, I'm only going to give them a factor of 5 because they're lacking in those other areas. We had no way of doing that, and it didn't make sense given Macgregor's claims that his command and control was better, his sustainment was better, and his leadership and training was better, to just arbitrarily take some blue force counter and up it by 10% to call it an RSG counter. So we needed a completely different way to evaluate this thing. And just sitting down at a table and having a RAND bogsat didn't make sense to us as a way of getting at this. So we wanted to do something different. And, it turns out that John's an old cavalry colonel himself. I'm an old infantry colonel. So we went back to what we had done before. We said, well, how does this work? And we took the idea of a ROC drill, the rehearsal of concept drill, that the Army teaches all the way from Ranger School through the War College, where you take the players, you take the plan, you put them on a simulation of the terrain, and you have each key leader walk through and say, it is now H hour. My unit is at this location. My job is to move from location A to location B along avenue of approach C, sees objective Tiger from the east. And that person literally walks down there, and while they're walking, the S2 says, okay, as he's crossing the LD, I'm going to have my scouts try to call in artillery fire on him. And then the staff and the commanders sit around and adjudicate what would happen if artillery fire happened right there. And you talk through it, and you can walk through in as much detail as you want every key event, every counter event that would happen throughout the operation. And in this ROC drill, that's how you smooth out the challenges of your operational plan, whether it's a Ranger raid or whether it's Schwarzkopf sweeping into the Iraqi Republican Guard. And so what we wanted to do was essentially turn this into a ROC drill. Macgregor had created a set of scenarios. He had claimed that the blue and the blue BCT force and the blue RSG force had both fought those scenarios a specific way, and that they had achieved certain outcomes. So we decided we were going to recreate those scenarios both for the BCT force and for the RSG force, and treat it like a ROC drill where a commander had to walk his forces through the battle. And at each step along the way, the blue force and the red force would talk about what actions they were taking. Not in a typical sort of game thing of I go, you go, and then we roll dice, or even a simultaneous movement and then we roll dice, but in a seminar style where we're talking about why are you doing what you're doing? How fast are you moving? What kinds of effects are you trying to create? How does the opponent's actions hamper or hinder you? What and all those kinds of things. And we had a white cell of subject matter experts on everything from Intel systems to EW systems to cyber systems to space and satellite systems to artillery to air, blue air power and red air power, and the same thing on the red side. And they would sit around, and each time a commander would say, I'm going to use this kind of system to create that kind of effect at this range on that target, we would engage the subject matter experts and say, what's your assessment? Can that happen? How would that work? What kinds of outcomes would that lead to? What should we assume about attrition? And we would make an adjudication. And if there was a difference of opinion, we'd go both ways. If somebody said it's going to happen, it's not possible, then we'd make blue say, well, what are you going to do if you can't do that? And we'd see one way. Or we'd say, okay, well, let's say it is possible. What happens next? And we'd go that way. And we might play another step or two until we sort of learned something. And then we'd go back and say, all right, we believe it's still not possible, but we've learned what might happen if it was. Then let's go back to the main storyline now and continue forward, and we go on with the operation that way. And so this way, in most cases, we avoided sort of bitter disagreements about outcomes or about possibilities, because we accepted all outcomes and all possibilities. We evaluated them, but then we picked one to use to move forward. And so this is the way the adjudicated TTX worked. It was just a ROC drill on steroids, blue commander and some staff, a red commander and some staff, and then a whole bunch of subject matter experts who could answer all those questions about whether or not what blue or red wanted to do was possible and what were the effects. And we could adjudicate it on site and move it forward. And as I did, as I said, you know, in early, when I introduced the maps, we did it at two levels, an operational level and a tactical level. So let me just stop there then, because the rest of this is going to kind of get into us doing some of that, but I want to make sure that that people are clear on the idea of a ROC drill and what we were trying to do with the adjudicated TTX. Over.
So there's been some discussion in the chat. Essentially, is it correct to characterize the adjudicated TTX as sort of as a blended adjudication where you go down different decision trees and reverse and go back and do another decision tree?
That is a part of it. So you're doing alternative analysis in stride as opposed to serially, or, you know, in parallel. And for the truth is that there were very few, well, not very few. There were relatively few times where we had to go very far in two different directions. In general, we could rapidly agree on a particular direction. Certainly when we played the BCT, we could, because that's kind of well-trod ground. With Macgregor, what would happen more often than not is he would make a claim that we weren't comfortable with. So we would first play it with our discomfort, where we would make him do something based on what we thought was possible versus what he claimed was possible, just to sort of see what effect that had. And we'd go just far enough down that to sort of get a feeling for it and take some notes. And then we go back and say, okay, we're going to let you do what you said your formation could do. And now we're going to see where the next friction point is. And as you'll see later, what we did with some of those sort of, you can call them false starts or those alternate realities, was we use those as the basis for post-ROC drill, post-TTX analysis, where we would actually use modeling in sim or some other analytic tool to help validate whether we were being overly cautious in what we were allowing him to do, or whether we felt comfortable in saying that it wasn't able to do that. So who else?
So we have some logistical questions when it comes down to the execution of the game, and I'll combine them. Can you explain a little bit more if Macgregor played the RSG during your games? And then the second part is, who played red, and was it doctrinally reflective of how red would play?
So yeah, I thought I had it on the next slide, but I guess I don't. It's on a slide later on. So yeah, so for red, we'd been doing Russia-Baltic work at RAND, you know, since 2014. In fact, the first time we did a Russia-Baltic war game, I commanded the Red Force, which was fun. So we had a bench at RAND of subject matter experts who have been wargaming as red in the Baltics, using scenarios very similar to the one that Macgregor used in his testimony for, at that time, over 3 years. And so we use them as our red team. And then for the BCT-based team, we brought in an active duty Army colonel who was a former BCT commander in combat, and whose current job allowed him the latitude to come and spend a week with us. And I think he brought one or two guys with him, I'm trying to remember. And so he commanded the Blue Force. And what was interesting about that was, you know, all of our BCT commanders who've commanded in combat have commanded in stability operations. They haven't commanded in this kind of maneuver warfare. And so he did sort of admit at times that he was rusty on some of the stuff we were doing, but he was well versed in current blue doctrine and current Army doctrine and an emerging doctrine, and he was able to talk from the perspective of somebody who commanded a brigade in combat over large distances and things like that. So he represented our blue team, and again, the people in the room from RAND represented 3 years each of experience of fighting blue in the Baltics with a BCT-based force. So we were able to sort of provide, I wouldn't say guidance to him, we didn't tell him how to fight, but we were comfortable answering questions and helping him understand what his options were and things like that. And then, yeah, we invited Macgregor. From day one, we invited Macgregor to be a part of the process. We interviewed him and his staff about his models, about his concepts. We had him validate at every step of the way that we were accurately representing his vision of the RSG and the way we crafted the games. And then he commanded the RSG for the games. He was in the room for all of that. He had some of his partners there with him to provide some of the subject matter expertise on some of the systems and to engage with us on some of our doubts from our SMEs about some of the claims about what their systems could do. So how's that?
That's perfect, Mike. I'll give you one last question before you press on. Did this, so a little bit about the scenario. Did the RSG lay down, was it CONUS based that required to be deployed, or was it a forward deployed already in your scenario?
So I'll go to the next slide for that. So these are Macgregor's slides from his briefing to the National Commission. And for those of you concerned about the confidential and proprietary information about that, anybody who provided any information to the National Commission did it under the understanding that it was going to become publicly available. All of this stuff in here, none of this was stuff that Macgregor passed to RAND that we use for the RSG. Every source material on Macgregor that I'm using today came by typing Macgregor and RSG and National Commission on the Future of the Army into a Google search and then pulling down slides that came up in a public domain. So I'll just kind of throw that out there because it's my way of saying you can go find them yourselves if you want. Although the slides will be available, I think, from Sebastian after this seminar. So Macgregor's broad concept, the overall concept, does include a different sort of deployment and employment of the joint force vision. But the specifics of the scenarios that we modeled were on the assumption that forces were already in theater. And this is what he briefed. So you see there in the center, this box around a set of Russian approaches through Vilnius and then breaking off towards Kaunas and Riga. This is the road to war that he talks about. And you see Washington responds by deploying air, ground, and naval forces over 10 days. U.S. Army forces deploy through Riga. And then what you see is his, on the left, his simulation model number 1, U.S. Army BCTs versus Russian independent brigades. So this is the one scenario that he posits, and you can see the 24,000 troops with 174 tanks, 302 IFVs, 180 strikers, and so on. Some Lithuanian forces in there and some Russian forces. You see sort of the traditional battlefield geometry for a U.S. Army division with 3 brigade combat teams abreast, supported by a combat aviation brigade, a sustainment brigade, and a field artillery brigade, with a Lithuanian brigade sort of holding the town of Vilnius itself. And there's an expeditionary sustainment command off the map in Riga for the US, and a Russian sustainment base off the map in Minsk. You see the 5 regiments of the Russian attack, 1 in our artillery regiment, and then the tank and 2 tank and 2 MRR with some attack helos and support. And this is the the scenario as he played it, with an 80-kilometer division front for this Army division. Then you see on the other side him fighting his 2 RSGs. So here, you know, he doesn't lay it out as a linear front. There's a blob that's called the RSG that has a 100 to 140 kilometer sector of operation. You've got the Lithuanian forces holding the sort of strong pointed cities, Kaunas and Vilnius, and the RSG is going to use those hard points as places around which it can maneuver to destroy these Russian forces as they cross the border. And you can see the difference in combat platforms. So he's got 322 of these Pumas in a armored gun system variant, 484 of them in an infantry fighting vehicle. Although those 484 infantry fighting vehicles put out far less dismounts than the 302 infantry fighting vehicles and 180 strikers of the other scenario, and so on. And so this is the situation that we had to recreate and do the TTX for. So we replicated the scenarios from the briefing, both RSG and BCT based. Here's where I told you we used a former BCT commander as a blue commander. We used Macgregor as the red commander. We ran it a couple times at the division or RSG level. So that was when we had the company sized chits on the map. And then we ran it again at the tactical level, where each chit represented an individual combat vehicle. And we used the time with our BCT commander to practice the concept and get our TTX techniques right. And then we did him first so that we could sort of establish the baseline and get running it right and sort of understand what we thought the current force was capable of doing, so we'd have a baseline to compare what the RSG force thought it could do. And then, like I said, after we ran the TTX, we did modeling and simulation based on claims about radar, command and control, and UAV capabilities. So Macgregor would make a claim that he could stay in contact with a scout screen at 50 to 70 kilometers of distance because he had this particular tethered comm system, and that it could do that because of the way it handled encryption and transmission, even in an EW cluttered environment. And so we did some evaluation of that. We sort of accepted it at the time, and then we evaluated it afterwards to help inform our report about whether we thought that was likely or possible. In one case, in the tactical vignettes, his counterattack force was far deep in Blue's rear because he claimed he had such high mobility for this Puma-based AGS system and IFV system. And so he had a trigger line for launching a counterattack against an approaching Russian MRR's flank. And when that trigger was tripped, he showed us where he wanted to attack it and told us when. And we sort of looked at him and said, "You're going to get from here to there that fast and launch an attack?" And he said, "Well, I've got cross-country speed of X." And so, yeah. So again, we were skeptical, but we allowed it to happen and we observed what the results were. We also said, well, what happens if you can't get that far, but can only get a third of the way or 2/3 of the way? How would you amend either your trigger or your attack? And he showed us, and we did that. And then subsequently, we went back and did detailed terrain analysis using a variety of different tools to do time and distance factors down the kinds of roads and trails this formation would have to go to get into that attack position. And we made our analysis about whether we thought it was likely he could have done the deep attack he said he wanted to do, or whether he was going to have to do one of the shallower attacks that we talked about. We did a lot of macro analysis post TTX about all the other aspects of .mil-PF and the force structure, but that's not really relevant to the idea of an adjudicated TTX itself. So the outcomes that we came to, and I think I've talked to this already. So we did this report for the Army with a comparative analysis, and I'm joyfully looking to the day that I can say it's hanging on the RAND website, but it's not right there. But we continue to develop and refine this adjudicated TTX concept. And in some ways, it sort of blurs into another RAND game engine called RFlex. But the idea is for us, and what we learned from this and what we've learned from RFlex, which is the engine we've used for a lot of the wargaming, is that although there is some baseline requirement to sort of understand basic loss exchange ratios, basic weapons capabilities, and things like that, what's most important is to have subject matter experts at the table who understand the underlying systems, and then allow people to say, this is what I want to do. Don't have it decided by a set of attrition charts or by a combat factor roll or by anything like that, but actually bring the seminar to the gaming table and have the seminar shape outcomes and rules while you're going. And this is sort of the heart of the TTX, is a way to air out in public the way you would do at a ROC drill, what the hive mind, the wisdom of crowds thinks would likely happen in a given set of scenarios, but grounding it in science, grounding it in subject matter expertise, and being able to layer on all the intricacies of the different systems of EW and C2, and even things like leadership and training. And you know, in terms of leadership and training during the TTX, if either commander made a claim of my unit can operate this way at this distance, we would say, okay, what happens when they lose comms? How do they operate? How do they know what to do? And, you know, one guy would say, well, I have a set of SOPs, or you know, they would stay static until they could reestablish contact, or I would have in my op order a rally point or something like that. Somebody else might say, well, I have, you know, it's all commander's intent. They're going to execute commander's intent, and I've trained with them enough that I know exactly what they're going to do and where they're going to be, and they know where I'm going to be. And we're going to get enough comms enough of the time to do things like that. But we could have those discussions and have them about how leadership and about how the impact of attrition affected leaders and affected unit cohesion. We could have that discussion about how intermittent comms or failure of comms affected operations without having to have had it pre-baked into a probability table or into an outcome table. And then we could usually come to reasonable agreement about the range of outcomes and evaluate each one independently without having to stop the game. And then we can move forward. And so that's probably a good place for me to stop on that. I think most of the rest of this is just your chance to ask questions, and I can try and pull up some of the backup slides if there's some other questions. And I see that the chat's real busy, but I haven't been able to pay a lot of attention to it yet. So lead on, Sebastian, lead me out of here.
Yeah, so the chat has been very active and lots of great questions. I actually want to lead off with one of the interesting comments about the adjudicated TTX model. Given that the expertise of the subject matter experts that you use for the game plays such a critical role in the adjudicated TTX, how many iterations were done for this particular project, and how would the results vary with the varying sets of subject matter expertise if you use different sets, given that there is a great variance between subject matter expertise consensus?
So what I'd say is that, you know, obviously for anything like this, the more iterations you do, the better, and the broader range of subject matter experts you bring to the table, the better. What I'd say is that for the TTX, we did not expect it to be the answer to the question. And we didn't expect it to be absolutely definitive. We got what we expected, which was it highlighted where the key friction points were, where there was disagreement, what needed to be measured differently. We never ended up having to talk a whole lot about the relative combat value of a Puma versus a Bradley. you know, or versus an M1. We talked a lot about, you know, under what conditions were you comfortable getting into a direct firefight with an M1 versus in an AGS Bradley, and how did that affect the way you managed your engagement area and those kinds of things. But and Macgregor, to his credit, you know, had a set of tactics that were optimized for the kind of platform that the Puma was, not for the kind of platform that the M1 tank is. But what the TTX did was it greatly narrowed down the areas where you had to do much more focused research. And so, again, you know, through the TTX, we uncovered the kinds of movement rate questions. We uncovered the kinds of comms relay questions and comms distance questions in a EW cluttered environment. We ran subsequent modeling and simulation of these Terries, artillery delivered UCAVs, and their ability to fly through Russian defended airspace. And so we could understand what the likelihood of them surviving to actually hit a target were under a set of different assumptions and a set of different kinds of conditions. And some of that we sort of adjudicated to keep the TTX going, but all of that we captured and then ran through more detailed modeling and sims before we wrote a report that said this is what you should do or shouldn't do, or this is what you should consider credible or not credible. So that was the value of the TTX, was not to give us the final answer, but to help us narrow down where we should do what kind of modeling in sim to help answer questions that we were able to better define through the TTX process.
So Mike, another question about the execution of the TTX is, did the TTX include a green cell that includes allies or partners? You showed a little bit of on your slides, but to what scope? Or did the blue cell that was exclusive other domains like air or maritime also play a role?
Again, the white cell, which was more than just the SMEs. I mean, that was John and me and some other people running the scenario. We have been running Baltic war games for over 3 years. We'd run them in England for a NATO community, which included Estonians and Latvians and Baltic officers. We'd run them, or John had been part of running them in Europe for a variety of different EUCOM and USUR audiences. So we were pretty well versed in that, and we were able to inject what needed to be injected from the green side. But in Macgregor's concepts and his scenarios, the green combat forces were primarily fixed in Vilnius or Kaunas and didn't play a major role in what we were trying to understand, which was how the RSG would maneuver to fight this enemy across the distances that its doctrine called for.
So the next question was the TTX played as the ABCT serving as the control in comparison to the RSG, which is the variable in the sort of the TTX data?
So in one sense it was, but in a broader sense, again, Macgregor's initial claim was that he had run the scenario twice, and that when he ran it with the ABCT, it lost badly, or with a BCT-based force, and when he ran it with the RSG won. And so we were sort of independently assessing that claim. We were asking ourselves, okay, we're going to run the ABCT, not Macgregor. What kinds of outcomes does it get? And again, knowing that we had fought the scenario so many times, the US divisions are hard pressed to defeat the kind of force Macgregor said. It doesn't surprise us that they would lose. The question was, would they lose as badly and in the way Macgregor said, based on his models and his game, or would we assess it differently than he did? So we were looking at the comparative outcome, not just the absolute outcome in each case. And I think I'm safe in saying this. What we essentially found was that both formations lose, they just lose in different ways. So we confirmed that the ABCT lost. We don't think it lost as badly as Macgregor laid it out to be, but we weren't able to confirm that the RSG would win. It lost about the same amount, or outcomes, but it got there in a different way. Let's put it that way.
So to follow up that comment is, did the TTX evaluate logistics and the consumption of supplies required per day of combat for both the RSG and the ABCT?
So we did a lot of logistics analysis outside of the TTX itself and sort of that broader thing, but within the TTX itself, for both the larger vignette and for the smaller one, so at both the operational level and the tactical one, we asked sets of questions about things like resupply, like medevac. Medevac was a big one. About the ability to sustain over time and how you would conduct, the whichever doctrine's version of log packs you were looking at the time. So we did dedicate a portion of each TTX to I want to say at this point, sort of the tactical aspects of sustainment in terms of how did you get it from the RSG rear to the RSG elements and units, and what impact did the halts for logistics reasons have on your pace of operations. We, in the more detailed analysis, did some of the like tonnage and basic load kind of stuff. And again, our assessment was that we didn't necessarily agree that Macgregor could haul or resupply some of the class 5 at the rate that he was firing it. And so we did some work on sort of trying to understand the implications of that. And for both forces, medevac in this environment is just abysmal. But when you start getting over longer distances with a smaller footprint force, it gets even worse. And so there were some medevac challenges that we identified also.
Yeah, absolutely. Since there's a question that popped up in the chat that's related to your logistical comment, is did the RSG require strategic mobility assets in its sustainment, or was it led to be fulfilled with intra-theater sustainment?
So Macgregor posits a sustainment command that has the responsibility for moving sustainment stocks forward. It is not parallel to, but not 100% dissimilar from the already existing Army doctrine. We did not model or examine the ability of getting those sustainment stocks into the sustainment command. Our TTX analysis was based on the ability to receive from the sustainment command the operational sustainment stocks and move them forward to the tactical units. There were, we believed, some questions about that handoff and about the role and composition of the sustainment command, but it wasn't the focus of the TTX.
So the next question was about the EW contested environment. How much did the TTX evaluate the RSG in a highly degraded ISR/EW contested environment?
That was probably 50% of the discussion. Every, because the RSG relies so heavily on comms over great distances, and it relies on unmanned systems for a lot of things, and it relies on long-range ISR capabilities and counterfire capabilities. At every step of the way, every time a unit moved, both on the big board and the small one, we were trying to evaluate what the implications of the EW environment were for that action. And so we didn't do as much with cyber, but with EW, it was a huge part of it. I'll just kind of leave it at that, I guess.
So actually, this leads into the next question quite well, is how much of the discussions, whether it be about logistics, medevac, EW, that were done during the game were merely noted for further analysis or allowed to be influence the next move or explore a different avenue of decisions?
So all of them were noted. Some were included in the report, but they all helped affect our judgment of what we saw was the goodness or what we saw as the challenges of the RSG. Um, we, again, very much didn't want to just say, okay, Macgregor, stop. You can't do what you're trying to do. We wanted him to show us what his vision of this thing was. So we would always stop and do well, we don't think you can do that. So let's see what that looks like. But then we would go back to, okay, we're going to let you do it and let's see what that looks like. And we never really told him no. We just always evaluated what would have happened if we had. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. On that note, when you guys were adjudicating amongst yourselves with subject matter expertise and among the players, was there a tendency for the extreme outcomes, whether it be extremely positive or extremely negative? Were there a tendency to rule those out? Because one of the comments asked, because usually in subject matter adjudication, the tails of outcomes, whether it be positive or negative, to often get voted off the island proverbially.
So there is, in general, a bias against gaming the tails, unless there's a very specific reason for doing that. I've had conversations with other RAND colleagues about that, and the answer is you don't want to build your entire strategy on the assumption that the other guy's going to roll a 12. Tails are tails for a reason. They are the unexpected or the unlikely, and yes, you need to be aware that they're possible. You need to be aware for that outcome, but until you've shown me that it actually isn't a tail, it is the norm. We sort of show a bias towards the center and not to the tails. But one of the nice things, again, about the adjudicated TTX, at least the way we ran it, was if we didn't want to run both the yes branch and the no branch, but we wanted to run the yes branch, the half the yes branch, half the no branch, like I said, on the counterattack, we ended up sort of saying, okay, you think you can get there in 10 minutes and launch this counterattack, or in 20 minutes and launch this counterattack. We think you can only get a halfway there or a third of the way there, and we could run all three of those. Which one of those represented the tail? We wouldn't know that until we finally got to the post-game detailed analysis. Same thing on, sort of an EW or a comms kind of a thing. It's easy to say, look, in that EW environment, 0% of your comms messages are going to get through to this unit. Therefore, this unit has to play the next 4 hours completely out of comms. We could have done that, but we could also explore and say, okay, if it was 4 hours without comms, how do you think the unit would behave, and why do you believe that? If you could get 10% of the time you could get comms through, what kinds of orders would you give it, and how do you think that would change its behavior? If you could get comms 50% of the time, how would that affect it? And so we could explore more than just 1 point or more than just 2 points on a spectrum. And so in that case, for selected reasons or for selected discussions, we could look at a tail and try to establish if there was a boundary condition of some sort that was worth looking at.
So this is also a more scenario-based question, was how much was the RSG or the ABCT judged against sort of a NBC, sort of a nuclear, chemical, biological environment in this scenario?
We did not play NBC for this scenario. He didn't in his original scenario, and we did not introduce it. So again, part of what we were doing, part of our research task, was to assess his claims that he had made in his testimony. And so we stayed within the confines of the scenario as he briefed it.
So the next question, who I know is from the who works with the Army, is does the RSG presume much streamlined planning and preparation components of the operational process, the plan, prepare, and execute that Macgregor has advocated for in his previous writings?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Does the RSG presume a much more streamlined planning and preparation components of the operations process, like the plan, prepare, and execute, that's in parentheses, that Macgregor has advocated for in his previous writings?
So he believes that he can execute a command cycle faster than the current Army doctrine would allow for. And that's based on both his belief that there are better AI tools and better integrated mission command platforms, and that with better training and a different staff structure and organization, you can enable a commander with information that allows him or her to more rapidly make decisions. And that based on the kinds of training that he thinks he can get by stabilizing the force using a different force generation model, that the commanders' relationships with each other better enable rapid execution of mission command. So essentially, yeah, he is claiming that he can get faster decision cycles, even given a bigger, more complex battle space than the current staffs are facing. If I think that answers the question.
So the next question is about adjudication. Would it be useful to have some pre-generated combat results, like a combat result table, available while doing this type of subject matter blended adjudication, simpler or more streamlined? Was there a lot of disagreement among the participants as to effectiveness, mobility, or even casualties during engagements?
There were not a lot of disagreements about what would happen once the trigger actually got pulled. There were a lot of disagreements about whether you would go there to pull the trigger or the tactics and techniques you use to get there. We generally, again, didn't have a big issue with, especially at the vehicle level engagements, sort of adjudicating who shot John, who got off the first shot and stuff like that. I think we all came from a common enough background and understanding of what battalion level engagement areas look like and how they work to do that. And then, we can play rapidly lots of things. What happens if the first shot misses? What happens if red fires first? What happens if blue fires first? So you can do a lot of that. You can, rather than rolling the dice once, you can roll them several times. The biggest on the operational table, when we were putting companies against companies and moving companies around, there were a lot more heated discussions about how set could somebody be, who was in a position of advantage, how much time did it take to get to places in a way that preserved operational security and provided protection and those kinds of things. So that was a little bit harder. There are, so RFlex, this other RAM platform, does use some sort of established norms of what you would think of as a combat adjudication table for different aspects of the fight. And there are some aspects of that that would be helpful in TTX. But we didn't find a need to use them. We could have gone that way if we wanted to, but we chose not to, and we specifically chose not to because we had no reliable data to create those kinds of tables for the systems Macgregor had drawn on paper.
So Mike, the next question was, in terms of research design, was there any variance or variation on the key assumptions such as the availability of robust reachback and the availability of C5 ISR, given that these outcomes would depend heavily on these, since the outcomes would depend heavily on these assumptions?
So there was lots of discussion about what that looked like and what capabilities were provided by the higher echelons and how well were they integrated and what kinds of effects did they create. In Macgregor's concept, though, the truth is the RSG owns its battle space and nobody else really operates inside of it. There is a theater sort of fires command that's doing theater kinds of fires and stuff, but it's not the same kind of shared battle space that you would think of today with the deep battle. The Joint Force Commander and the Fires Command Commander can choose to make capabilities available down to the fire coordinator in the RSG for him to employ for certain missions and stuff like that. And so, which is somewhat similar to sort of a general support reinforcing or a general support fires capability today. But we did question a lot the fidelity of information available to the RSG that it was receiving from national and joint feeds as opposed to from its own feeds based on the environment, especially based on the fact that some of those nodes were under attack by Russian air themselves and stuff like that. So the adjudicated TTX gave us the flexibility to question all of those, to play through the what ifs of, again, what if you get 10% of the information? What if you get 50% of the information? What if the information is latent? What if it's 10 minutes later than you think it is, or 50 minutes later than you think it is? What if it's wrong? I mean, all these kinds of things, and sort of play it through in a what if. But with icons on a board and with subject matter experts sitting around talking about it, and with the acolyte sitting there talking about what he believed was possible based on the work he'd done. So so that was a strength. What I'd offer is, even in an RFlex kind of a game, which is less structured than a typical sort of joint staff or combatant command war game, we had all those same discussions and we had the same kinds of subject matter experts. But what they would do was they would use that discussion to change the odds of the die roll. So, prior to discussion, we might have said, okay, on a die roll of 1 to 3, you get this outcome, 4 to 6, you get that outcome, 7 to 12, you get this outcome. And then somebody would say, well, let's talk about this challenge with C5 ISR. And we'd have that whole discussion. And at the end of it, they would say, okay, now it's 1 to 2, you get outcome 1, 3 to 4, you get outcome 2, and 8 to 12, you get outcome 3. And so they would change the probabilities of outcomes based on it. Whereas we didn't do probabilities of outcomes. We just established an outcome, but we established 4 different outcomes and looked at all 4 of them. So I think we had a more robust way of doing it in the TTX.
So backtracking a little bit, does the RSG model pose any challenges with interoperability or coordination with the other services, given that there's that operational level that's removed in the RSG?
So the claim from Macgregor is that the suite of mission command systems and tools that he is populating in his talks are fully joint, and that allow his fire support team to use, and his intel team to use, any joint platform for ISR or strike, based on whatever guidance and authorities the RSG has been granted by the JTF commander and the fires command. We played that. We gave him that option, but the truth is that at least in the way he fought the RSG, for the most part, he fought it as an organic unit. He very rarely would say, this is something I'm going to handle with passed down fires. Although he would assume that he had passed down intel, that he had a better intel picture than maybe the BCT did because of the jointness of his mission command platforms.
So, Mike, a question that sort of dovetails into that is, given the central claim of a more rapid decision cycle for the RSG, how did you model or evaluate different decision cycle speeds, particularly given its major claim in the RSG model?
So, again, we would look at time distance factors. We would hear his claim about, and we would do what you would do in a ROC drill or in a course of action development process, where we would actually look at, okay, what's the trigger line? What's the amount of time needed to clear the fires, to send the fire command for the firing units to receive the mission, and to actually pull their trigger, and then look at time of flight. And we did some real detailed step-by-step analysis through that at several points for fires missions. For maneuver missions, we would also do the same thing. We would sort of say, what makes you think you have enough information at this point to make that decision? And what was it that triggers it? And so we could look at those kinds of things and walk through trigger lines and decision points and see what role cycle time for decisions made at both the operational level with battalion commanders and group commanders giving orders to company commanders, and at the tactical level with company commanders and battalion commanders giving orders to vehicles and platforms. And in cases where we made the decision that cycle time of decision making, things, and again, decision making includes things like clearing fires. It includes things like confirming a trigger or a decision point has been reached. It includes things like receiving and processing the information that led you to believe that you'd had a trigger line pulled or a decision point reached. Where we thought that was important, we would play both versions. The you get it in time, or the no, we think you're going to be slower than that, and what happens. And we would try to dig into, why do you think you're going to cycle faster than the BCT does in this particular case? What is it about the RSG per se that does that? And if it was a leadership training thing, we just sort of note, okay, he's attributing this to those kinds of things. If it was a mission command thing, we would sort of note the reliance for his success on turning what was on paper into real electrons. And then we could assess later whether or not we thought that was likely or possible. So, for example, we've been chasing a joint enabled TOC for 20 years. We haven't gotten there. I'm not sure why Macgregor thinks he can get there next year, but there's that. Over.
Thanks, Mike. The next question is, would you find these sort of tactical vignettes helpful to other forms, other types of assessments of this kind? Or do you think it's only useful in this particular case, given the lack of data on a lot of these future concept weapon systems?
So strangely enough, I was talking with a colleague yesterday about some work he had done a couple years ago for RDECOM. They were trying to evaluate the relative contribution of a basket of different potential capabilities to enabling, boy, is this a jargon-filled sentence, and I apologize to everybody for that, but to enabling US forces to fight more effectively in dense urban terrain. And what they ended up running was actually a version of the TTX that we did for the Macgregor project. So so we have found that, if you're working with concepts that are ill-defined or not well measured, if you're working with technologies and platforms where you're not really sure what the right TTP are going to be for using them or what the real parameters of their use are, this is a great exploratory way to do it. And again, with the idea that you come out of it not with the yes, no answer, buy this, don't buy that, but that you come out with better questions that do lend themselves to effective modeling and simulation, where before you didn't have the information you needed for a more formal kind of game or analysis.
Circling back to a comment you mentioned before about how the red player was played, was the TTX ever played with a red commander? Was the TTX played with a red commander that had limits on how they could deploy, or if they were limited by enemy doctrine, or were they allowed to explore the whole range of decisions and reactions against blue activities?
So we do require red to fight red doctrine. We don't let a red commander come in and fight like they're, a NATO guy or a U.S. Army guy. We spent a lot of time with INJIC and other places to make sure we accurately understand how Russians fight at each of the different echelons. And so we don't straitjacket, we don't script red, but we do ask them to play as if they truly were Russians. And I got to say, so what is it now? 6.5 years of Russia-Baltic wargaming that I've been around with RAND, nobody has ever questioned us on how we've played red. And again, we've played versions of this all across Europe with all kinds of players. We've played it here. In fact, when we were doing some support to the Army's study on next generation warfare, they participated in a lot of stuff we did, and never, none of their experts ever gave us grief about misrepresenting red or scripting them too much or giving them too many degrees of freedom. I think they were very comfortable with the latitude and the boundaries we gave them. That doesn't mean we did it right. It just means if we did it wrong, everybody agrees that we did it wrong the way they thought it should be done wrong. So.
Mike, so the next question says, how does the time investment compare to other types of wargaming approaches that might have been considered for this project?
So I think it was a time and resource saver. And again, because you use the least refined instrument, the bluntest or the broadest axe to do the majority of the work. And then you save the fine detail, the expensive tools, to do the refinement and the clarification around the edges, the confirmation or refutation of hypotheses. But we didn't have to invest a whole lot of time in trying to quantify stuff until we were a lot smarter about what we wanted to quantify. And we didn't have to quantify everything. We knew exactly what we had to quantify. We didn't have to do the hard work of coding a JICM run or a simulation or developing a new model for the entirety of what we were trying to do. We could narrow it down to the specific questions that required that level of fidelity. And so from that perspective, I think it was a huge time and resource saver. And then I'll also say that, and this may sound strange, but there's also a return on investment for it. So the human capital development of all of the support people and all the players and all the SMEs of sitting around and having the discussions that we had as a result of the TTX or in executing the TTX was huge for developing human capital, both for us and for non-RAND participants, including the blue team that played, the brigade combat team. Macgregor, I think, will tell you he learned a lot by doing this. And that kind of learning, I don't think it's replicated if you turn all this into modeling and sim or run it through JICM. The only people who get smart there are a bunch of coders and simulators. So I think there's a huge return on investment. And I'll turn it back on you, Sebastian, because you were part of this or some of it. What do you feel like you got a return on investment by being part of the research team in terms of the learning that you did?
So a little bit insider baseball. So I was part of this team that John Gentile and Mike Linick led at RAND, and I was just within my first year at RAND, and this was one of my favorite projects, given that how much time and how many times we iterated on this problem, whether it be with Macgregor or the BCT commanders, or we even internal play tests. As an analyst individually, I learned a lot about not only the Army, but the concepts that the Army were considering, and also about red forces and their sort of doctrine. So I learned a lot, both as a designer, as an analyst. So moving on to the next question was, how much of the human factor, whether it be fatigue or attrition, was considered when adjudicating some of these results within the adjudicated TTX, Mike?
It didn't come up a whole lot during the TTX. It came up in a couple of specific contexts. And again, Macgregor had a huge amount of separation between his sort of recon screen and his main body. And so there were a lot of questions we had about the ability of these kids to sort of evade and fight their way back through that depth of battle space before they could be relieved in, and pass through friendly lines and get a break. So that was one of the areas where it became sort of a big issue. The other area where it became an issue a little bit was actually not in the TTX itself, but in the evaluation of the Puma. And some of the reasons why the Army rejected the Puma originally as a platform around which to build its next set of armored vehicles that had to do with human factors and the vehicle. So
the next question is sort of a loaded question, given it, despite its simplicity, was, did Macgregor leave happy from his experience?
I don't know in the end that he was happy with our report. I think he enjoyed the TTX. I think he learned from it. I think that he didn't disagree with everything we said was a challenge. He just discounted the difficulty of overcoming it. But yeah, I don't think at the end of the day that anything less than us saying to Congress, reshape the entire Army around the RSG, was going to fully satisfy him. So he left less than fully satisfied. I don't know that I would say that we really burned a bridge, I don't think, but or had him storming out or throwing things or anything like that. I don't think he would do that. Whatever else he is, he's still a professional. But we did not give him, I don't think, the endorsement he had hoped to get. I also think we didn't put in the coffin nail that he thought we might. So kind of a middle of the road answer there.
So Mike, there's a follow-up question, is, did he subsequently refine his concepts with RAND's input, or do you just not know what he did afterwards?
I have not had contact with him since we finished the study, nor have I really seen more of his published work about the strike group concept. I think as many of you probably know, he was floated at several points as a potential Secretary of Defense. He, I think, is currently presidential appointee in some ambassadorial or some high level kind of a thing. And of course, with that term ending in 8 or 9 days. So I think he's continued to put himself in a position, or trying to put himself in a position, where he can affect DoD military policy. But I'm not staying abreast of what specifically he's advocating these days. You know, it is interesting to read through his body of work, the 3 or 4 books he's written. I read them with a grain of salt. There's a lot of great thought in there. I think there's some, in some cases, poor analysis or leaps of faith. But I actually think that Macgregor pushed the Army further than a lot of other people were successful at doing, just not as far as he wanted them to go.
So a question sort of about the RSG concept again is, did he discuss or figure out their organization, how the organization could sustain casualties or manage replacements during sustained contact if reserves and National Guard and other active duty fight under the same or different operating concepts?
So one of the aspects of Macgregor's force structure writ large and his belief in the broader concepts that he espoused was that campaigns would be quick. They would not be long and sustained, or if they were long and sustained, it wouldn't be the RSGs that were the critical force structure for that. There would be these heavy combat groups that would do that. And I'm not sure if I've got the right slide for yeah, so I mean, here's some of the slides that are in his brief in terms of like rates of fire for munitions and stuff. I talked about that. Here's his vision of the Puma. I don't know how many of you guys have been jostled inside of a Bradley, but I kind of looked inside of a Puma, and I'm happy that I only got jostled inside of a Bradley. You know, his get that to stop. Come on, there we go. His belief that he could get the entire RSG into 2 LMSRs, whereas it took, you know, with the combat power of what was delivered by these 7 LMSRs. Let's see. This is his organization, some information about the systems. This is his Sky Ranger SHORAD system. This is another one that we really didn't have good data for, and we sort of had to find a way to play. One of the things he did buy off on was how difficult it was to use helicopters, and he changed his concept of helicopter use as a result of this TTX. He did buy into our arguments about the IAD's effects on helicopter usage. Let's see. I'm looking for something specific, and it's not there. Give me just a second. And that's not what I want to be showing. Okay, hang on. Sorry. So this is another one of his briefs that I took some of the slides from, and I'm not sure if this has it. I apologize to you guys that I can't just jump to the right slides. That's his Lanchesterian model results. All right, so here's his overarching force. So 4 reconnaissance strike groups, 12 of these combat maneuver groups, 6 of these infantry combat groups, and 4 armored or airborne air assault groups. And then these aviation combat groups, strike groups, theater missile defense groups, ISR groups, combat support groups, engineer groups, and NBC groups. And here's how he allocates manpower to it. And he says, you know, it takes 250,000 troops in the active component to do this, not including all the institutional army kind of stuff. But this is what he then organized into rotational groups where this number of units are divided into basically 4 buckets, so that at any given time you've got 1/4 of that in each of these phases, and they rotate through these phases of pre-deployment, which is where they're doing training, deployment where they're being used, reconstitution, and then modernization and training. And then, of course, if you're deployed and a fight comes up, you pull the pre-deployment people forward to reinforce it. And so that's where you get, you know, his belief that for almost any contingency, this is by itself enough to handle it. But if you need to fight a second contingency or fight a bigger contingency, you can get it. And there's your 3 heavy combat maneuver groups, which replicate heavy divisions, in addition to your RSG, which can do, you know, pretty much everything. So anyhow, I'm going to stop sharing now and just kind of leave it at that.
So Mike, I have a few more questions before we let you go.
Sure.
Given the impact of subject matter experts on the conduct of this TTX, what qualities did you look for in your team members? And did you have any concerns or validation of this of a SME upon arrival to ensure that they had the necessary skill set to ensure the modeling success or the wargaming success? I will say that, you know, I mean, obviously I was a great choice for your team.
So, you know, one of the great things about RAND is that we have a lot of in-house subject matter experts, and because we don't work on pre-formatted teams, over the course of a few years, you get to work with a lot of different people. So clearly, John and I had a wide range of expertise with who was available at RAND, what their expertise were, and how comfortable we were that they could bring an open mind to being an SME in a situation like this. And so I'm not going to suggest that there's anybody at RAND who's you know, closed their mind and only believes that certain things can be true. But yes, picking the right SME who's got the mental flexibility to ask themselves, could I be wrong? You know, or how certain am I that I'm right, is important. Picking SMEs who are collegial and able to contribute to the discussion as opposed to being divisive and frustrating the discussion. Those are critical aspects to building a team for a TTX. The director, which was John or me, has a role in shaping the discussion so that you keep it productive, and you cut off debate when it's not productive anymore. And I think we were able to do that. But so by and large, you know, I think we were good at it. Which is a luxury that, you know, say a brigade or division commander doesn't have, where, you know, whoever's their fires coordinator is their fires coordinator, and he or she's gonna be the one who talks when it comes to fires. And if they're a little bit too doctrinaire, then the brigade commander or the battalion commander has to step in, but they don't get to choose who represents them for fires. It's whoever's assigned to them. Maybe they got to influence the assignment thing. So yeah, so if you're going to run something like this, picking the right team is important. And to me, the critical aspects are they understand the technical parts of the system, but that they're open-minded enough to ask and answer for themselves what-if questions, or to field other people's what-if questions in an inquiring way and not a dismissive way. And I think we were very successful for the most part with that. And where I thought we were running into some kind of friction, I had the latitude to go find a second SME and ask them either during or after, and to also rely, like I said, on the fact that this was not my first rodeo fighting this exact scenario. Maybe fighting it with an RSG, but not fighting it in general. So Now, Macgregor brought his own SMEs, and obviously he got to pick those. And that's a different kind of an engagement, but one I think that ultimately we made collegial and professional and not adversarial. So there's that.
So Mike, I have a couple of quick questions for you. One is, what would you like to see as an ideal follow-up to this project, to this Adjudicated TTX project?
I don't know that I'd like to see a follow-up to this particular project in terms of the RSG, but I do advocate for and try to find opportunities to use the Adjudicated TTX as a tool within RAND or any agency's analytic kit bag that is in addition to the other tools that they have available. And you know, one of the things, and I know you guys talk about this, I'm sure at the Wargaming Society, to the extent that you're going to use games to do policy analysis, is finding the right game for the right research question, the right tool for the right research question, and not trying to force a research question into a game or a tool that it is not well suited to answering it. And so my hope is just that this technique gets put into the hands of people who can execute it better than I did and continues to live, because I found it, and I found it very useful in this case. And I know we found it useful again when we were doing the dense urban combat one. It's just not one that a lot of people immediately think about because they're used to more formal games and models and simulations. And this sort of rock drill TTX kind of a thing doesn't immediately spring to mind. So that's kind of my goal.
Next question, sort of straightforward. What books or book are you currently reading, and what books or books do you recommend?
Well, you guys can see that behind me is my bookshelf. What am I currently reading? Actually, right now I'm reading the Lightbringer series, which is some science fantasy, which I'm enjoying very much. It's sort of a break between semesters. I'm getting ready to teach insurgency and counterinsurgency this semester at school, so I'm going back through Galula and Mao and Che and all that kind of stuff to get myself regreened for that. The book upstairs that's on my nightstand, I'm trying to remember the name of it and the author, but it's basically a re-look at all of the U.S. Government's attempts to change regimes in the Middle East since the 1950s. And I think it's called Losing the Long War, and talking about how often our attempts at regime change have failed us both in the short run, or where they've even been successful in the short run. In the long run, they've created problems as bigger than the ones they were designed to solve. I don't think it's one of the better books I've read, but it's interesting. So how's that?
That's great, Mike. And I will, as facilitator, ask the last and final question. And we're trying to do a mix of questions for our speakers. But for you, I want to ask, ignoring funding and time, what is a war game that, whether analytical or educational, that you would like to see designed soon or in the near future?
So the sort of like holy grail for me that I've really spent a lot of time sort of thinking about and never gotten anybody to bite on would be a game where you forced the combatant commands to buy forces. So right now, combatant command requests through the global force management process have no resource implications for the COCOMs themselves. Forces are a free good provided by the services. And so they all want everything and they want it all the time. And, the economist in me, and I'm not a school trained economist, but I love reading books about economics. That's what that whole shelf over there is all about. Says that that's not how we allocate scarce resources. That's not an effective or an efficient way to allocate scarce resources. And so to me, I think it would be really cool to see what force presence might look like and how plans for major theater operations would change if the COCOMs actually had to pay for their requested capabilities. And so if the COCOM wanted a 1.0 presence of a carrier and knew that it had $1 billion a year cost, but instead could get a 0.5 presence of a BCT or a 2.0 presence of a BCT for half that, which option would they take? And how would that decision get made? That's the game that I think would be fascinating to make.
You should get funding for it, Mike, and put it on your team. And lastly, I want everyone to know that Mike Linick was part of the RAND team who created Hegemony, which is a game, a RAND game that we published, last fall. And I will put the link in the chat, but also in the YouTube description. And I want to take this time to thank you, Mike, for taking 2 hours of your time, I know, which is very busy. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
No, I was happy to do it. And if people have follow-on questions, michael.linick@gmail.com, send them to me, and I'll find time to try to respond to them once you've seen the slides or if you have follow-on questions. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I thought you guys asked some great questions. There's some of them are very similar to the ones we ask ourselves, and I'm sorry I couldn't just give you a copy of the report. But good luck to you all. Thanks.